Thank you very much, James.
Thank you, Monica.
It's a big pleasure having you today.
That's very kind of you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having me today. It's a great honor to be here. My name is James Lindsay, and in 2018, I was the crisis manager at Cambridge Analytica. Formerly, I was in the British Army, and I also, after leaving the Army, was a PricewaterhouseCoopers consultant, and I specialize in resilience. So today, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk to you about Cambridge Analytica, but really what I'm going to talk to you about is the personalities that were involved. I'm going to talk to you about the crisis path and the risk vectors, and also the lessons learned. And I think that's really what's going to be useful for you as CTOs, analysts, and specialists in your field. You know, what can you take away? Cambridge Analytica, what was it famous for? Well, it was famous because it had an expertise in elections. So if you were a politician and you needed a team to work out who you should market to, how to cut the data, how to understand the segmentation within that group of people who you needed to message, you use a company that is fantastic with data. And Cambridge Analytica was that company. Cambridge Analytica became very famous because it was asked at one stage to do the data for the Trump campaign, and it accepted that challenge. The company was basically run by 3 people, and there are so many small companies that you guys are part of, as part of the tech community. Alexander Nix headed it up, Julian Wheatland was the COO, and Dr. Taylor, Alex Taylor, was the chief data officer. And the company was really run by these 3. When I came across the company, it was operating out of 2 locations, the UK, London, and America. It had mainly 2 offices, one in London, where it had about 40, 50 people, and the other one in the United States, in New York, where it had about 40 people. And then small teams in Washington and Virginia who were doing sort of specialist projects. These 2, it was very much a normal company, a normal setup. What happened was that Cambridge had become the attention of certain newspapers who felt that they were manipulating data rather than just cutting segments, and they were trying to manipulate people. What happened was on the 14th of March, it was very much a normal day, when delivered to the office where Alexander Nix was working in London were 4 letters, not dissimilar to this letter that I put in front of you. And these letters were from 3 different companies, the New York Times, the Channel 4, /ITN, and The Guardian. And they were telling them that they, in the next few days, were going to release some extremely bad news about the company. And it was a very difficult period, and that's when I volunteered, if you wish, to become their crisis manager. I had been doing some work for them, and I knew these letters, because we discussed them openly, were about to arrive. So when the letters arrived, we took apart the letters, and we set up a crisis management room, a CMT. So you guys, when you have a crisis, the first thing you need to do is to get hold of your senior team. And the CTO is absolutely critical within that team. We developed a plan about how we were going to, A, answer all the questions that are coming from the press. And you've got to remember, when the press come with these letters, they put in it stuff where they're fishing for you to give them an answer. We also responded to the key employee who had started to work with the newspapers. And we didn't know this, but they had been planning this for 2 years. The board that I put up, the picture behind me, is part of that analysis. The New York Times, The Guardian, Channel 4 ITV, you can see on the left-hand side, and the Information Commissioner's Office were all interested in this data that supposedly Cambridge Analytica had, this array of Facebook data. Now, the Facebook data was important because obviously Trump had just been elected in 2018, and if they could prove that the election had been manipulated, then there was a chance that they could impeach Trump. Also, at the same time, they could also have a go at Brexit in the UK, because Brexit was underway and a lot of people wanted to undermine it. However, on the second day, on Friday morning, we held our first crisis management team meeting. We briefed all the staff, we started the legal fight, and we replied to the media. However, that evening, and we had been told that they were going to go public on Saturday, but that evening, Facebook suspended Cambridge Analytica. So all our timelines suddenly came forward. Facebook was incredibly important to Cambridge Analytica because 75% of its business was advertising. And there are so many clients now that you will use Facebook as well as Google. But Facebook is critical, and they couldn't deliver to their clients without Facebook. So I'm going to hand you over now to Shelby Holliday for 2 minutes, who explains the problem, I think, in a very wonderful way.
Facebook and its CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, are under a ton of pressure right now. So much pressure that Zuckerberg nervously sat down with CNN to say this.
You know, I think what's clear is that in 2016, we were not as on top of a number of issues as we should have, whether it was Russian interference or fake news.
The latest issue? Facebook admitted that a developer who had accessed the data of 50 million Facebook users later sold it to a political firm called Cambridge Analytica. That firm was later hired by the Trump campaign. Facebook says both parties violated its policies, but many users feel the company could have done more to protect their data, and a growing number of people say they're leaving the site. So this is 2018, but to understand what's happening today, you have to look back to Facebook's policies between 2007 and 2015. In 2007, Facebook opened its platform to developers, meaning it allowed outside apps to access all kinds of user data. Did you ever play the game Farmville? Or did you ever use Tinder or Spotify? You may have noticed that when you use these apps, they ask you to sign in through Facebook. Back then, Facebook allowed apps not just to access your information, but also to access the information of your friends, and that helped the apps and advertisers better understand your preferences. During this time, Facebook became a fixture in its users' lives. By allowing access to that data, Facebook paved the way for all kinds of apps to help people find dates, search for jobs, be productive, and stay entertained. It also ushered in a new style of political campaigning.
The new Obama 2012 smartphone app has everything you need to get the president's back wherever you go.
And that, in turn, fueled the social network's growth. In 2007, Facebook had 58 million users. Today, it has more than 2 billion. But back to that period we were talking about. In 2014, Facebook dialed way back on its data sharing policies. It announced that it would restrict the data that apps could access, and it would stop allowing developers from getting the information of your friends without their consent. Those changes were implemented in 2015. But this period in Facebook's history had already opened the company up to some of the massive problems it's facing today.
If you pass on that amount of information to somebody who's trying to manipulate you politically, then of course they're able to exploit your vulnerabilities and send you customized messages that no one else will see, and no one knows what those messages are.
In 2013, when all of this data was still available, a Cambridge University researcher accessed the information of 50 million Facebook users. That data was ultimately sold, against Facebook's policies, to Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica says it's launching its own investigation to determine if the firm engaged in any wrongdoing. Now, Facebook says it's investigating all of the apps that had access to massive amounts of user information. But that's a lot of apps, a lot of Facebook users, and a lot of their friends.
Well, it's hard to know what we'll find, but we're going to review thousands of apps.
Okay, so the ins and outs of it are quite simple. If you have a relationship with Facebook, you could analyze their data in 2013. So the 50 million up here, speaking to Dr. Kogan in the middle, was that relationship was legal. But because that's what's in the terms and conditions with Facebook, with the developer. However, the 27 million on the right-hand side Facebook profiles, that were then analyzed by Dr. Kogan and the results given to Cambridge Analytica. So they weren't actually given the data, they were just given the analysis. That is the bit that is questionable. And so when Facebook discovered that Cambridge had this data, they asked Cambridge to delete it, which after a sort of battle, because obviously Cambridge had paid for the data, they deleted. If, however, Dr. Kogan had come down the bottom path and had worked for Cambridge Analytica, this would have been perfectly legal. So the crisis management team was formed. On the left-hand side, we had one team under the COO that dealt with the finances and the legal aspect of it. On the other side, underneath the CMT, and the CTO basically had that up, we dealt with all the things that were really difficult with the company. And we changed the way we communicated. We communicated in a very open way. We had meetings every afternoon with the whole team. We knew that at these meetings, we had people in the company who were talking to the press. So you couldn't have any secrets. You had to operate in a very different way. A note, and I said I'd pull lessons out as we go along. So the first lesson is you only know what you know and have seen or found out. So if someone tells you something, you need to ask for the emails and you need to see it. As a management team, when you found something wrong, you'll be judged on what action you took. And that is absolutely the case. And part of the reason that I think Cambridge has not been prosecuted any further, bar the fact that it doesn't exist, is the fact that they took the appropriate action at the right time. And lastly, if your company or product damages someone or something, you need to own up to it and rectify it. So those are three really important things that you should do. So we've got this golden time. This was us preparing for what was going to happen. And unfortunately, as I said before, The Guardian then jumped. Facebook jumped, then The Guardian jumped, the New York Times, Channel 4, and really the press war started in earnest. We knew that for every day that week, there was going to be a new program on Channel 4, which was going to expose something, terrible about the company that was somehow going to, affect us internally, and indeed it did. So this, the employee who worked with the Guardian was called Chris Wiley, and this is Chris Wiley on the right. And I've got a short video from Chris that I'm going to show you in a minute, where he talks a little bit about who he is and why he felt that he needed to come forward.
I played a pivotal role in setting up a company that I think has done a lot of harm to the democratic process.
In an era of big data and fake news, political leaders are changing, and so too the way they campaign. What you post on social media is being watched, being used, and what you see is crafted like never before. And bestriding this vast digital frontier is Cambridge Analytica, a company which trawls.
Okay, so these are pretty scary things they were saying. And basically what they were saying is no one in their right mind would vote for Trump or Brexit. Therefore, ordinary men and women must have been manipulated. And they were looking for a company. They were looking for someone that had done that. And if I draw it up like this, along the top, you can see that in the UK, as I said before, we had Brexit. And the objective was to render the referendum result null and void. And down the bottom, we had the effort to impeach the US President of the United States by saying that somehow Russia was involved in it. These are huge streams, if you wish. You cannot swim up a stream if you've got this much coming down at you. It is very, very difficult. So, and all the newspapers were putting Cambridge Analytica right in the middle of this. Part of the 2-year preemptive strike that they did on the company was to launch a sting operation on the company. This was very cleverly done by Channel 4, where they interviewed senior executives in a sales situation, and they cajoled them into saying things which really they should not have said. Now, Cambridge was a very young company, as much as your companies are very young. It didn't have a lot of people in it, but what they didn't have was a set of values. And that, I would say, is a really critical thing. So if in your company you don't have a strong set of values which you hold your people to, you could really consider doing something about this, perhaps in the next couple of days. Because what happened was these senior executives were made to say things that if they had had a set of values, that was practiced and instilled, they wouldn't have said. Leadership in a crisis drives everything. Within 3 days, on the Tuesday, the CEO was forced to resign by the board because they said we cannot have senior executives saying these sorts of things. This left the company rudderless. You know, the company did not have media-trained people. It only had the CEO. So if you do not have media-trained people within your company, you really need to think about that, because in a crisis situation, who are you going to put in front of the press? The press, you know, need stuff to print. They need to print a story. It's 24/7. The pressure on journalists is total. There is no let-up. And these guys will start inventing stories unless you feed them. So you should consider a website, a dark website, or something like this that you can bring forward if you have a crisis ongoing. And remember, the first 24 hours of a crisis is critical. It's in that 24 hours that you set the story. You cannot change it after that, because the press will repeat whatever you put out in the first 24 hours, and if it's not right, you've got a big problem. On the first week, we got to the Thursday, and so we were beginning to get that team up and running, and things were going okay. Yep, nobody had quit the company, and indeed throughout the whole process, only 12 people left the company, which I consider to be a real accolade for their management team in terms of how they stayed together, because this thing went on for 8 weeks, and the pressure was immense.
Once again,
Thursday
the Cambridge
morning.
Analytica offices in London were the centre of some attention today. The building was evacuated after a suspicious package was identified, but it turned out to be a false alarm. Tomorrow it could be the information commissioners, investigators going in if they finally get their warrant.
I cannot tell you what an impact that one incident had upon the people in the company, because suddenly they had to leave their office because they had a bomb in their office, supposedly. And what it was one of the cameramen outside who were besieging the building needed a replacement camera. But it wasn't a camera, it was a set of wires that were delivered in a box. So not only did we have to evacuate our office, but we had to evacuate all the offices above us and below us. And in a funny sort of way, that saved us, because it stopped the press understanding who worked for Cambridge, and we were able to spirit everybody off to a pub around the corner. But psychologically, that really shook up people. The other thing that happened at the end of this week was the Crisis of the Week is published in one of the American papers, and it reflected upon how Cambridge Analytica was doing under this pressure. And it gave us a green card. It told us that actually, for the pressure that we were under, we were doing okay, and that we should keep going with what we were doing. As I said, the onus is on your organization to supply the information the press need, and this should be on a website. So you will not have time during a crisis to set up this website. It is something that needs to be set up in advance. Okay, so if you don't have enough cash and a crisis plan, it is very unlikely that your company will survive something of this magnitude. Cambridge Analytica had enough money for 3.5 months, plus some money for lawyers. And in May 2018, it reached the end of that money. So effectively, at that stage, the company had to close. The board of directors knew that the money was coming out, and they decided that enough was enough, and that they needed to close it down. Not to mention the ongoing investigations, none of which have produced anything about Cambridge Analytica that were going on. So I'm hoping that the things that you're going to take away from this are that at the end of the day, you need a crisis management plan, you need the cash. If you could set up a dark website, you'd be well on your way. You need to have practiced that crisis management plan, otherwise it's just not going to happen. To bring you up to date, 2021, the Information and Commissioner's Office reported that they had found no Facebook data on their services, on their servers. Yes, they had found some derivatives, so in other words, some translations or, if you wish, some analysis, but they had not found the data. So Cambridge told the truth the whole time, and we, as we knew they had, because we asked the data scientists to research every single server we had as soon as it came out. They didn't have the data, and by this stage it had been well documented by the Electoral Commission in the UK that they did not take part in Brexit. The seeds of an organization's potential failure lie within its current construct. That is really what I'm leaving you with. That means that if you don't have values within your company that you stick to and that you practice, you are, at the moment, laying the seeds of your own organizational failure. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings me to the end of my talk. We've got 5 more minutes now at the end for any questions that you might have, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you guys would like to ask.
James,
Monica.
thank you very much for
That's
this amazing talk. We have time for one question. So, alguien en el público que quiera hacernos una pregunta para James y se da traslado. Tenemos el micrófono preparado. Y si no, te voy haciendo una pregunta. Okay, let me ask you.
Sure.
You have talked about how they manage the crisis. It could be avoided. Any way could Cambridge Analytica have avoided the situation in any way?
Yeah, so could this crisis have been avoided? Well, it's difficult to say, because if you wish to do a data audit of your company, and that was one of the things they did look at, it was going to cost between £200,000 and £300,000 to do that data audit. But effectively, it was too late for them to be doing that data audit. And they didn't want to do it earlier on because they felt that it would be wasted money. There was no reason for them early on to do it. However, this crisis brought down their entire company. So in retrospect, it would have been great had they done the audit when Facebook said, well, have you deleted the data? And Facebook just asked them to sign the affidavits to say that they had deleted it. And they could have followed up with an audit in that instance to prove that they'd actually deleted the data. So that would have saved them one aspect of it. But the other aspect of it is, because as a company they were a young, highly educated company, and whilst they had a mission statement and they understood, how they would treat people, because they, made sales pitches the whole time. They had teams working with different clients, from, chocolate manufacturers to people who sold apartments. They felt that these values that they had were sort of inbuilt within them. But the reality is, these values need to be documented, they need to be practiced, and they probably need to be in everybody's annual appraisal to really bite and for people to really understand them.
Thank you so much. Yeah, for sure.
Not
we
at
have
all.
learned so much with you. Thank you very much.
Not at all, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure having you at 15 INCIBE. Un fuerte aplauso para James, por favor.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you, Monica.